Hello and welcome everyone to the Spectra and Veeam webinar on cyber attack protection. Today from Veeam Software, we have Matt Lloyd, Global Alliance Manager, and Ron Martin, Solutions Architect. Ron, I think you're going to do most of the heavy lifting today from the Veeam side. And I am Bob Cohn, Product Specialist and Director of Sales Enablement for Spectra Logic. Now, cyber attack sounds like a pretty ominous way to start your day out, admitted, but I hope you'll find a lot of encouragement in our talk today. I think everyone would agree that the way we protect data has changed. So we're going to take a slightly different perspective today, and we're going to look at data protection from that perspective of what's driving the behavior behind these changes. Clearly, protecting data from outside attack is huge. There are really too many types of outside attack to address all of them in one webinar. But by addressing ransomware specifically, I think you'll find other outside attacks are thwarted, and it'll even better prepare us for natural disasters. And on the lighter side, a conversation just as important but not quite as ominous is how these same tools can kick in and help us under new regulations like GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation out of the EU, which affects not only organizations within the EU, but anyone who does business outside of the EU with EU residents. Also, these same approaches and tools can be used to aid in cloud adoption. So it's a really big conversation today, but I think you'll find it interesting and hopefully insightful. Let's start with our promised topic of cyber attack and ransomware. To better understand ransomware, what it is and where it came from, I want to start by looking at the type of malware or attack that we've heard the most of until the last several years, and that's your basic data breach for identity theft. Now, it's interesting because the way this attack occurs is much different than what we see with ransomware. First off, the hackers have to get access into your systems, into your file systems. They have to search for the type of individually identifiable information that they're looking for, take a copy of that, then they have to turn around and sell that to some third-party crime ring, which is going to turn it into a stolen social security number or create driver's license, issue credit cards, etc. As bad as this has been, and as bad as this still is, I guess the silver lining here is that the original data is left in place. So when you come in day one after a data breach, your organization is still running. Many organizations aren't even aware of this type of data breach until months later. It's really a difficult type of breach for hackers because of all the things that they have to be involved in and do to make this from the crime side profitable. We see a very different story when we look at ransomware. This is spread via a virus attack. So all a hacker has to do is create an email with a ransomware virus in it, email that out to thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of email addresses, and anyone that clicks on the link and sets off that executable will suddenly encrypt all of the information on any affected systems. So the interesting thing from the hackers' approach is this is much easier. It's also much more anonymous and less likely to catch the people behind ransomware, as we have seen people be caught behind some of the other types of malware that are spread. Their upside is it's an immediate payoff. Your systems are stopped. You can't do anything until that ransom is paid or until you've figured out some other way to thwart this attack, which is what we're going to talk about today. So what's happened with this evolution of cyber attack is, unfortunately, it's gotten easier and easier for the attackers. And you want to talk about how easy? We talk about data center as a service, DCAAS. We talk about software as a service, SaaS. What about ransomware as a service? Really? Yeah, really. These are examples of ransomware as a service applications from the dark web. I do not recommend anyone try to get there. It's a very common place for the hacker community. This one you see on the left, tox viruses, was one of the first to be created. Basically, what you can do is use one of these applications to create a ransomware attack. You literally can create the message that's going to appear. The providers of these applications handle all of the backside. If you look at the one from Shark ransomware on the right, you can see they're marketing this fully customizable, fully translated, fast algorithms, monetization. You will receive 80% of the payment amount directly to your Bitcoin wallet. So these types of attacks have become incredibly easy to perform and incredibly difficult to trace back. If we ask, how did it get so easy? How did we get here? Well, we have to look at where this type of attack started. So many people aren't aware of the fact that ransomware, actually, the first documented case of ransomware was back in 1989. Why do I have newspaper clippings on the screen to illustrate this? Because back in 1989, that's the way we communicated. As archaic as it sounds today, we wrote stuff down, printed it on paper, and distributed those papers manually. This was an attack that was performed, interestingly enough, by Joseph Popp, a PhD from Harvard. He was an AIDS researcher, and what he did is he created 20,000 disks. Yes, those are 5¼ inch floppy disks. He had an application that helped profile the AIDS virus. He sent this out to thousands and thousands of AIDS researchers worldwide. When you loaded the diskette and opened the application, it was fairly clever. The attack wouldn't occur until your system had been rebooted 90 times. He didn't want an immediate trace back. So after you rebooted your system for the 90th time, and again, think back to 1989, the first thing we did, if anything happened, was we rebooted, so it didn't take all that long, and boom, all of your files would be encrypted. This is literally the screenshot of the piece of information you would get once those files had been encrypted. How did you get it unencrypted? You wrote a check or used a money order, cashier's check, and you sent it to a P.O. box in the country of Panama. And that's how you were supposed to unencrypt your information. Now, we know about all of this because Joseph Popp was caught. What was his motivation behind it? Again, very interesting story. He was using the money for AIDS research. Of course, that old adage, the end does not justify the means, comes into play here. My point is, if ransomware attacks started back in 1989, why is it that it didn't go mainstream? Why have we just heard about it in the last few years, and how has it become such a serious threat in the last few years? And that is quite simply because of the World Wide Web and cyber currency. Now, the World Wide Web and cyber currency have created incredible opportunities for everyone. It's made life and business much easier for everyone. But unfortunately, the flip side to that coin is that it's also created opportunities for the bad guy. It's made it a lot easier for the bad guy. So one of the things we want to start with today is, how do we thwart that attack? How do we take the ease out of a successful ransomware attack? And I think Ron Martin, who's about to join us, one of the first people that I ever heard take the 3-2-1 rule, which I'm going to ask Ron to explain, and turn it into the 3-2-1-1 rule. So Ron, jump on and tell us a little bit about this 3-2-1 rule, how we've manipulated it, and how that can help us in ransomware.
Yeah, sure, Bob. Absolutely. I was going to say first, but wait, it gets worse. I mean, so one of the things that we've seen fairly recently, over the last probably 18 months, with some of the ransomware variants that have come across, our tech support desks, radar and whatnot, is that not only is ransomware rolling out there and encrypting a bunch of stuff and then trying for ransom. But they understand that, that there are mitigation strategies out there with, not just Veeam, but, any good data protection vendor. So one of the things that's happening now is instead of just going out and encrypting the files and calling it a day, the ransomware is actually going and doing whatever, using whatever engine it can to traverse your network and look specifically for backup file formats. So in our case, VBKs and VIB files, or our competitors, the same, they have other file formats with other types of extensions. But some of the ransomware variants are actually going out, traversing your network, looking for these file formats and deleting the backup files first, and then running whatever encryption activity they want. So yeah, they
Wow.
The bad news is, right, I mean, it's not just a matter of encryption. I mean, it's a matter of the ransomware is trying to protect itself before it does its nefarious action. So again, so from a Veeam perspective, we've always espoused this. Let's see, Bob, you want to throw me back to the mouse control there? So we've always espoused this 3-2-1 rule, where obviously having a backup is light years ahead of having no backup. But actually, I think you actually made me the presenter, Bob. Let me switch it back to you.
Okay, bear with us. This is not a ransomware attack.
Yeah, this is not a ransomware attack. We had this worked out.
Learn how to use our software.
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, I'm going to try that again and see if I can give you control.
Here, let me request. Okay.
You've got it.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, I may have to have Bob advance the slide, but that's okay. Bob, if you want to hit the first,
absolutely,
first advance there. So 3-2-1 rule is, one backup is great. One backup is, again, light years ahead of having no backups. But ideally, if you want to get a more broad protection scope, 3 backup, recommend having at least 3 copies of your backup data on at least 2 different types of media, and then one of which is off-site. So again, try and cover all your bases there. We want you to apply this 3-2-1 rule to your backup, to your data protection strategy. Now, the thing that's happened that like Bob has talked about and we've talked about already is this whole ransomware world where we really want not only 3-2-1, but we want the 3-2-1-1 corollary, which is one that's offline as well, because whatever data that you have stored in a backup, if it's online, again, these ransomware variants are getting really, really smart, and they're targeting stuff that's online. So really the only way to absolutely guarantee that recoverability in case of attack is to have a completely offline copy. And then we'll talk about a couple options there, but obviously there's one that we prefer more than the others, and that's actually tape. So from the good news with 3-2-1-1 and the Veeam partnership with Spectra is that they can cover your 3-2-1-1 bases here. So we work with a lot of partners that maybe they have a spinning disk, or maybe they have tape, but so the good news with Spectra is they have both. So for your primary backups, for your backup copies, for your offline long-term retention with tape, Spectra definitely to encourage you to take a look at the Spectra line of products to cover your bases there. Let's go to the next slide, Bob.
And Ron, try advancing the next slide. Let's see if we can get you this too.
Okay.
There we go.
Oh, there we go. Okay, cool. Nope, and I went too far. There we go. There we go. So just a quick example. This is a Veeam specific example for a city of Sarasota, and we have a number of these on our website if you're interested in taking a look at those. So they had a ransomware outbreak where it came in through a particular employee's desktop. It encrypted several of their file servers. the cyber criminals made really an outrageous demand for payment. And the good news is they're a Veeam customer. They were applying the 3-2-1 rule or a variant of it, and then they were able to recover very quickly without having to pay anything, and and get back online, get the business back online in a very, very quick and efficient manner. So what I want to take you through, I wanted to talk about a few practices as well. And these are mitigation strategies. They're not necessarily, so I'm not going to say, oh, if you apply this particular paradigm or approach, you're absolutely guaranteed to, be invulnerable from cyber attack, because obviously it's there's no one thing that you can do. So what I intend to do, and frankly a lot of these apply to any data protection solution, not just Veeam. Some of them are fairly Veeam specific, but really it's just a way to improve your security posture relative to cyber attack. And one is again, it's fairly obvious, but role-based access controls. So instead of for instance in a Veeam environment, just giving every domain admin full Veeam backup administrator capabilities, is let's actually segregate that down to the duties that are appropriate to the user's role. So instead of doing this, let's actually segregate it out. So if you have help desk users that it might need to do, help a user with a file level restore, or maybe even do an image level restore, let those guys, assign those guys a backup operator role or something similar if you're using some other type of solution. Or maybe there's a very small handful of people that you want to be full administrators, or if you have audit and compliance people that need access to your your Veeam environment, again, just make them viewers. Don't try to keep that backup administrator group as small as you can. The other thing that we definitely want you to make sure you do is, certainly you can back up your Veeam server. Obviously, that's something that you're free to do. Beyond that, we want you to back up the Veeam's do a Veeam config backup. So allocate some storage. I mean, the config backups are very tiny, but then we don't turn it on by default. But go into your Veeam config, turn on the backup config protection. And make sure that you always are able to, even if you don't have a Veeam backup, you could lay down a Windows server, install Veeam, and then overlay the configuration backup on top of it to get back to exactly where you were before. Then we do have some practices around credentials that we espouse, such as for the Veeam backup service, the context that service runs in, you can give it particular credentials. It's a really good idea to have, those credentials are the only thing that can back up, say your primary, backup repository. So that not, everyone, in your Active Directory can see and read write, your storage for backup repository. If you can narrow it down to just the Veeam backup service credentials context, that would be ideal. It's a fairly extreme example, but in some cases you might be able to do this. We even have, so we have the ability with a backup job to do a execute a pre-job script and then a post-job script. So we have had some people posit that they could potentially do things like, maybe if you're backing up, maybe if your primary backup is just to a bare metal, kind of server, some JBOD. Maybe enlisted a Pixie boot, tell it to wake on LAN, wake it up, and then shut it down. When you finish your job. Now, obviously, that presents some difficulties if you need to do some real-time restores. Like if you need to do a file level restore in the middle of the day, then you're going to have to remember to bring your storage back on. So again, there are some difficulties with that. But again, it is definitely possible, with the system that we have in place. So in terms of, there we go. So in terms of credentials also, one of the things that we espouse, when you do 3-2-1, then you have, you'll have a copy, in your primary backup storage, say that's Verde. Then maybe you have like some older, slower storage that is not doing much else, so you can make a secondary copy for it. Well, in those cases, what we would recommend is instead of using the same credentials to access the primary and the secondary backup copy repository is just simply, use different credentials. So again, if if credential A is violated, if it's compromised in some way, and the secondary backup repository is taken out, then you still have the primary backup repository, or vice versa. The other thing that we would recommend in thinking of this 3-2-1 and multiple copies and how we do protection is alternate file systems, for instance. So with Veeam, I mean, you can do SMB, you can do Linux, you can do Windows repositories. You can also store to other types of appliances as well. But for instance, when the WannaCry ransomware variant hit, it propagated through SMB. So say you have your your primary backup storage is SMB. Well, in this case, you might want to think about, hey, I've got this old Linux server out there. It's got some storage attached to it. Maybe I make that my backup copy repository. So that ransomware that could traverse and propagate itself through SMB, probably not going to be able to propagate itself through NFS simultaneously as well, or vice versa. If it can propagate through NFS, probably not going to do both, right? So it's just a different way to help protect against compromised credentials and in the native ways that the ransomware variants propagate themselves over the network. But again, in terms of completely making sure you have absolute protection in case things are compromised on-prem, air gap is the way to go. So when we say air gap, we mean offline backups, and backups that are not connected to any type of network at all. So we do have a couple of different ways to do it. I mean, we do have, it is possible with Veeam to back a storage repository with what we call rotated drives. So what a rotated drive could potentially be is maybe have a big USB, maybe I have like 4 or 5 like big USB drives. So I could plug them into my Veeam server, assuming it's physical, I guess, and then I could rotate those drives over time. And when I popped in a new drive, if I click the right checkbox with my backup job, it can say, oh well, I've got a new drive today, so I'm going to start a new backup chain. So again, maybe for SMB type customer, or one that's doesn't have huge terabytes of backup data, that could be a potential air gap strategy. However, you're going to hit some very, very quickly hit some operational and procedural and storage, I think, size limits with that approach. So really, the tested, proven, trusted way to do this is definitely tape, and that's one of the ways that we partner with Spectra very heavily. So definitely tape is the way to go, we believe, with an air gap backup strategy. A few other things that we can provide, that are more Veeam specific in terms of helping you with recoverability, or is one Assure backup. So obviously, like I said, it's great to have a backup, but it's even better to know that your backup is recoverable. So we have this facility within Veeam where we can actually boot from a backup image. So we have this technology called vPower, which effectively can present the backup image, the Veeam backup, to your hypervisor as a legitimate, say if it's vSphere, VMFS, file system, so that the hypervisor can, read our emulated VMFS file system and boot VMs. So with Sure Backup, what we're able to do is you can actually go in and say, okay, I've got this, maybe it's SAP, or maybe it's, some other type of application. Maybe it's an internal application. It needs authentication, so I need a domain controller. It needs a web front end, so a web presentation. So I've got a web server and the database. So I have multiple VMs that comprise this what we call an application group. What I can do is in kind of batch background mode, I can periodically go in. I can spin up our vPower engine, present these VMs. You can boot them in a particular order. You can assign, timing. You can tell it to, wait until, I can ping the VM, wait until VM tools comes up, and then you can do some application specific tests. Out of the box, we're able to test for, if it's a domain controller, is the global catalog service running? If it's a SQL server, is SQL Server active? It's a web server, something listening on 80 or 443. We can do some basic tests. You can also script those in as well. So again, the whole idea is, not only do I have backups, but I know I can recover from them. And that's one of the things that we provide with the Sure Backup technology. The same thing can be applied, the same core technology, core vPower technology can be applied. So say you have a case where you've had a ransomware outbreak, but you've been able to contain it, and maybe you've contained it to just one or a handful of virtual machines. Well, we have this capability called instant VM recovery. So this is actually lets you recover a VM without restoring the VM. So in this case, if you've taken the bad servers offline, what I can do is I can roll back to a restore point in my backup chain that I know is good. Then I can simply use the same technology to present the backup to the hypervisor and let it boot, so that effectively, if you have, if they say I have a 20 terabyte Exchange VM and I had to roll it back to some particular point in time, well, instead of, moving and rehydrating all 20 terabytes of that data to the primary backup, VM production storage, this way I'm able to effectively bring that VM back up in the time it takes to boot it effectively. So then if you decide, if you mitigate the ransomware, on the VM images themselves, great. I mean, you can shut this down and start the original VM backup. Or if you decide this is the way I want to proceed into the future, it's simply just doing a storage migration from the simulated VMFS data store that we're presenting to the hypervisor to your production storage, and you're back online and going at it.
And Matt, I just want to jump in and stress how important this is, what you're talking about, because it's not just the fact that you can recover if you've got the appropriate tools in place from a ransomware attack, but it's also the fact that you are doing a huge recovery. This could be like a disaster recovery. So being able to test it, being able to know that it works, being able to have access to that data quickly becomes the next most important thing. You say, oh, great, we're covered for ransomware. We don't have to pay the ransom, but we are still down until we clean this up. So I just want to bring to everyone's attention that whatever you can do to enhance the performance after you've identified the threat and said, yes, we've got the means to rebuild, is just huge.
No, absolutely. And that's actually a great segue to my next slide. One of the things is, so what about the smoking crater, scenario? So you have I'm talking about instant VM recovery. Hey, maybe I've found it, I've caught it, I've mitigated it, and I could, have a handful of VMs I can spin up and I'm back on business and things are good. What about the scenario where your entire site is down, you are locked up? Well, that's the other thing that we provide with Veeam, that sometimes it gets lost in the shuffle, right? So it's backup and replication. So that replication piece is pretty key too in a disaster, in a ransomware recovery scenarios, because one of the things that we also provide is DR with Veeam, so that if I have my primary site and I'm doing my backups and I'm taking precautions, but then I also have a secondary site where I'm not just creating backup copies, but I'm actually replicating on a timed basis, on a scheduled basis, live VMs to another, say vCenter. So if I have local vCenter, local vSphere environment, I have some compute that's up in the cloud, or if it's in a secondary site, I can also make sure that those VMs, particularly my most critical VMs, are actually staged and ready to run in that other site. So again, in the case where my primary production site is just completely down, completely offline, I'm able to, without running the full restore process, I'm actually able to cut over and spin up, VMs in my secondary data center with Veeam. So we have these, for instance, we call them failover plans, so that, I can, launch the VMs in a particular order, in particular timing. We even have a newer capability we call Veeam Availability Orchestrator, which actually goes so far as to, take take the failover plans that you've created and add some special sauce and be able to spit out recovery documentation, and it'll do a lot of really cool things, and actually some really cool things coming in the version 2. But basically, again, this lets you recover in the case where it's catastrophic failure, and I need to recover my entire site in recovery mode, offsite or in the cloud. So again, this capability, we talk a lot about the Veeam's backup capabilities, but sometimes we kind of forget about what we can do with DR and replication, and this definitely has analogs into being able to do cyber recovery or cyber protection. So the other thing that Bob mentioned up front was GDPR, and I guess what's happened is with the GDPR regulation coming into effect this past May, is one of the things it's really forced people to do is take a serious look at their data protection strategy, because there are a number of elements of GDPR that are very, very highly data protection related. So such as not only do if I store someone's data, I have to be able to recover it. So obviously that has direct hooks into being able to do data protection. There are portability constraints, access controls. A lot of that actually feeds into what people are doing with GDPR. And the one thing I wanted to stress here was, if what I'm not saying is, oh, if you implement Veeam in your environment, you're GDPR compliant. I mean, that's certainly not the case. GDPR is a much broader set of regulatory constraints that if any software company is saying, oh, just implement my stuff, you'll be compliant, I would pretty seriously question that. But we do have some capabilities to help you down the GDPR path. So I wanted to go through a few of those, because this is probably something that you're facing, that we at Veeam have faced, and really anybody that does any kind of business that has hooks or touches the EU is going to be expected to be compliant. So a couple different things. One of the things that you need to know is, if you have PII data, where is it? So one of the things that we can do is help you with the discovery process. So we have a couple different things, a couple different facilities that we can provide you there. One are Veeam Explorers. So for instance, if you need to do email discovery and you're already backing up an Exchange server with Veeam, we have an Explorer for Microsoft Exchange, so that you can go do all manner of search and recovery and restore and exploration of the data that you have in Exchange. The other thing that we can do is something we call data labs. So there are actually some new things that we're going to be doing with data labs that are very specific to your GDPR journey. So with data labs right now, this is the same idea as I talked about with Sure Backup, where we use vPower. We present the backup as, for instance, a VMFS data store, and we can boot VMs and run them in a particular order, do all that stuff. So Sure Backup is really the background validation method to make sure stuff boots and works. Data labs are the, foreground interactive means by which you do this. So that when we do this, we spin up all these. And one thing that's important to note is when we actually run these operations, we actually start a tiny, we register and run a tiny little Linux. You can think of it as kind of a NAT appliance in your virtual infrastructure, so that all of this is done in network isolation. So again, we don't want to create IP conflicts and whatnot within your virtual infrastructure. We want to make sure that that's taken care of, and that's actually how we do it with what we call the virtual lab proxy. And we actually do some networking, hypervisor level networking to help facilitate that as well. So with these data labs, we're actually able to go in, take this vPower restore, this vPower run, and go and do exploration. So if you want to do this, say you want to do discovery, you've created your own tools, you've purchased a tool, but you don't want to impact production, you can spin up a data lab, go in, run your discovery tools, run your scripting, do whatever you want to help, you get down the process of identifying, where, how much PII data that you have available. And again, these can actually be, you can actually, some layer on some third-party technologies here. For instance, we've partnered with, there's an IBM product called Stored IQ. There was a product from a company called Data Gravity, which is now high trust, that's called Cloud Advisor, that's actually able to mount, Veeam backups and analyze crack them open and analyze the data within them. There are a number of tools that you can use to do this in addition to the facilities that we give you with Veeam. The other thing that I wanted to mention here is right now the whole data lab concept is, you spin it up, you run whatever discovery, patch testing, whatever you're going to do, and then you turn it off and it goes away. So one of the things that we've done specific for GDPR with data labs is this. So say that someone exercises their right to be forgotten, and you've created a facility or used a third party to purge that data from your production data set. So that person is forgotten in your current production. But if you have to recover from a backup, say in a ransomware situation or whatnot, how do you do that? How do you make sure that when you go to production that data is deleted? Well, with the upcoming version of Veeam, what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to spin up one of these data labs, and you're going to be able to run whatever tooling that you've created or have on hand to exercise the right to be forgotten. So you can purge it out of that data lab that you're running. The cool thing is, instead of then having to just delete that, and it doesn't go any further than that, and then have to redo the same process in production, we're actually going to let you migrate those VMs to production, pre-purged. So we're calling the feature "Forget Me Not." I guess it's "Forget Me So," specifically for doing, helping facilitate GDPR and right to be forgotten. Because if you're not familiar with the regulation, GDPR does, you can exercise right to be forgotten, but that doesn't mean that you as an organization have to go delete personal information from every single backup that you've ever created. That's would be onerous and again over the top. So you don't actually have to do that. But with the new data labs, we think we're going to help you. Help you get down that path. The other thing, again, we talked about this before, was, you have to be able to recover, your PII data, again, with guaranteed recoverability with sure backup. You have that in place. The other thing with GDPR is there's some fairly strict rules around allowing PII data to be exported outside the EU. So one of the things, and again, this is not any hard control that we've set, but to help our customers deal with those types of regulations, one of the things that we've been able to do in the more recent versions of Veeam is to set a geolocation on a data store. So we on a repository. So we don't actually turn on location tracking and whatnot. This is an administrator. The onus is on the administrator to set these locations. But if in case you have some VMs that you're backing up in the EU, and you say, hey, I want to land these backups on this particular Veeam repository, if it's outside the constraints that you've set, it's going to give you a warning. It's going to say, hey, this is, we're not sure where this repository is in this case, or this repository is in the U.S. Are you sure you want to do this? So that people are more likely to be conformed to the laws that are put in place in terms of data sovereignty. So the other thing that you can do, again, going back to what we do with backup and replication, if you have say a VM that's running in your U.S. data center that's primarily storing, EU data, with our replication technology, you could actually replicate that VM up back to a European data center and then do a permanent failover of that VM back up there, just so that data, lives where it's supposed to, and it is very seamless for you. The other thing that we've added with this whole data sovereignty notion are some additional reporting capabilities in Veeam 1, so that if you do have these violations or potential violations based on the locations that you've set for your repositories, you're actually able to run a report directly out of Veeam 1 that show these, and potentially your audit and compliance people would want to see and then take a look at. The other thing that we don't, if you haven't followed Veeam closely in the past few years, you may not know that primarily a VM, virtual backup solution for many years. But we've also added agent capabilities to the portfolio the last few years, so that, if I'm running a few workloads on, say, a Zen server hypervisor or a KVM hypervisor, or if I have still a lot of, a substantial amount of bare metal workloads, I can actually install a Veeam agent directly to the OS on those, and in the same way get that data into my Veeam repositories, and potentially be able to do similar sorts of discovery on it as well. And again, even for laptops and whatnot, we have agents that can help you centralize that data so that you can analyze it. The other thing that we can do with Veeam 1 is, again, you have to make sure that the workloads, the servers, the VMs that are storing PII data are protected. It's because you have to be able to recover them. And again, if you haven't looked at Veeam 1 in a while, definitely take a pass at it again, because it has a number of built-in capabilities to show, well, it'll look across your virtual infrastructure and say, I can tell you, these VMs are protected, these VMs are not, or these VMs are protected, but they don't have a secondary copy. So you can do all of that with Veeam 1, and it's a very quick way to help you down the GDPR protection compliance path. The other thing that we, of course, provide is encryption. There are strict encryption facilities within the GDPR framework. So, but understand one thing about encryption. I mean, with our encryption, everything is, there are some points at which we enforce encryption by default. For instance, if a backup, any traffic that crosses from a private IP address range to a public IP address range, we're going to encrypt. So there's nothing you can do to turn that off. But we don't encrypt out of the box, by default. Our backup repositories are tape, and I think this is actually where Spectra can add some value as well there, Bob.
Thank you. Outstanding job. One thing that came up as you were presenting there, Ron, was, what does GDPR stand for? And I want to make sure that everybody's clear on this. That stands for General Data Protection Regulation. This is a regulation that is born out of the EU, the European Union, and it affects any organizations that deal with information on individuals who are citizens of the EU. So it doesn't matter whether your organization is located in one of those European countries or not. Even if you're outside of that area, these regulations will apply to you if you're capturing information on those individual users who do reside in the EU. And where this becomes, a very interesting thing is what happens, and this gets back to that kind of original data breach that I talked about. What happens when you are breached? The things that can help us with GDPR can help us outside of GDPR as well. If you have a data breach in the US, it's incredibly expensive, and the greatest expense that comes from that type of breach is having to reach out and contact every individual whose record has been breached. So if you think about that, and I've received a couple of letters saying, your credit card was breached. I went to CU, University of Colorado. They used to use your social security number as your student ID. Those student IDs were stolen. I got a letter saying that social security number has been breached. Who's going to write those letters? Who sets up the website? Who sends the letters? Who contacts these individuals? That's where a lot of the cost comes from. As a matter of fact, Ponemon Institute is a great organization that tracks this. They did a report in 2017, and it's about their 5th report they've done on data breaches. They attribute the cost of data breach as $141 per contact breached. So even though this is going to help us with GDPR, it's also going to help us with just that good old-fashioned data breach type of attack. Now, the reason I put this Article 34 up is because this is actually the verbiage that comes from that document, the General Data Protection Regulation Specification. Article 34 deals with this. What happens? How do you communicate to the individuals whose PII, personally identifiable information, that's PII. How do you identify, how do you reach out to someone if their PII has been breached? Well, it's not required that you contact them if you've put something in place that renders that data unreadable. And it says here, in particular, those that render the personal data unintelligible to any person who is not authorized to access it, such as encryption. So encryption is key. And we've got encryption on the fly, and then we've also got encryption at rest. So if you look at what Spectra does with encryption, is we've taken encryption and encryption key management and embedded it into all of our tape libraries. Now this is AES 256-bit encryption. It has never been breached. It's considered the golden standard out there. That encryption actually runs on the LTO drive, but you have to have some way to turn it on and off, and what information will be encrypted, what won't, how do I create keys to manage that. All of that encryption key management is built into the operating system of every Spectra library. Now, crazy as it sounds, and we think, yeah, if you're putting information, especially on a removable piece of media that could simply go missing and suddenly you have to treat that as a data breach, it's got to be encrypted. Yet Information Week just relatively recently did a study and found out that 45% of all individual organizations are not encrypting their data. And when they ask why, they come up with it's expensive, it can be cumbersome, it can occasionally slow down performance. By embedding encryption in the tape library, we take care of all of that. It's built into our operating system. Our basic encryption, which is AES 256-bit encryption, is free of charge. It's the same GUI that you would use to access any configuration or management aspect of the tape library, so it's super simple, and it is wire speed because it's happening at the tape drive itself. There's absolutely no performance hit. And we're talked a lot about tape with the air gap. Of course, we also manufacture disk solutions, and on that end, we offer all of our NAS solutions with a self-encrypting drive. So just another way to make sure that you're encrypted at every level. Now, I want to jump back to you, Ron, to kind of bring us home with our final promise, and that was around cloud and cloud transitions. So tell us a little bit about how Veeam helps us get that information out and into the cloud. And if you're speaking, Ron, you might be muted.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry, I was muted there. Sorry about that. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, but... so again, just to reiterate the 3-2-1 rule, we 3 copies, 1 offsite, 1 offline. When with sure backup, we can guarantee, there are no, there are going to be no errors doing the recovery. However, the majority of the customers. Oh, there we go. Oh, well, actually. 40% of their backup, 40% of businesses don't actually have any kind of offsite backup capabilities. So with Veeam, what we intend is to make it really, really super simple. So we want to make sure that you have some mitigation capabilities with offsite backup without having having to go and deploy infrastructure, at a remote branch or a remote site, and administer it and maintain it. We want you to be able to use the same, facilities within Veeam that you're used to. And so we have a capability we call, Veeam Cloud Connect, which is, provided by providers from the likes of, Amazon or Azure and AWS and IBM Cloud down to, regional VCSPs, regional cloud providers. So all of these providers, sign up for our program, and what they effectively do is let you rent, cloud repository or compute space, so that what you can do from Veeam is directly from the Veeam console, go in, you sign up with the service provider, you tell them what amount of data you need. They would ostensibly provide different tiers of service and storage capabilities. And then within Veeam, you're simply able to, enter the credentials that they give you into the Cloud Connect provider space. And then once you enter those credentials, effectively you have just another Veeam repository that looks like any other Veeam repository within your management infrastructure with Veeam. So again, there's no VPN that's needed. It's all encrypted over its own particular TCP port. It's fully integrated. You can do backup copy jobs. You could even potentially do primary backups if you wanted to, although you would get some limitations around some of the advanced functionality like instant VM recovery. But again, you can create those backups, get something off-site, in an OpEx model that's very, very, very inexpensive. Or and they also actually many of the cloud providers also actually let you do data DR as well. So again, not all, but some do. So again, it's a quick and easy way to get your backups off-site and fulfill that requirement of 3-2-1. So I think I'm going to pass it back to you, Bob. I don't seem to be able to advance it. So there we go.
It's back to me. Beautiful. Thanks, Ron. Now, I want to say a few words also about how does tape work with the cloud, and how can tape actually help you with cloud adoption. It doesn't sound like the most obvious thing, but I think when you hear it, you'll see how this can be a powerful combination. Before I go there, I want to say just a couple of words about tape technology. We view this as an old technology, and I just recently had its 60th birthday. Disk just recently had its 50th birthday. But if you look at one of the absolute newest technologies in the industry, flash, when it comes to storage, that's based on memory chips, one of the oldest technologies in the industry. So what's beautiful about all three of these technologies is they have continued to evolve. If you look at tape, just last year, a brand new tape read-write head was introduced called TMR. It stands for Tunneling Magnetoresistive Head Technology. What you need to know is it can read and write a much denser pattern of data onto tape. So this is brand new technology incorporated for tape technology. Fujifilm introduced a brand new type of tape medium. Up until LTO6 tape, we had metal particle. We now have barium ferrite tape. And two interesting things about this tape technology. We all know, or most of us know, that tape has a 30-year shelf life, which is why it's a great archiving technology, but it can be subject to corrosion. If you look at the oxidation, excuse me, hard word to say, that is responsible for that, barium ferrite is already oxidized, so that cannot occur to barium ferrite. It also has a tighter design. If you see in that graphic that honeycomb design, I happen to be a beekeeper, and I will tell you that is nature's most perfect shape for storage, and that is the shape they use on barium ferrite, as well as honeybees use to store their honey, interestingly enough. So finally, you look at this new head technology and you look at this new tape technology, and what that gives us is this crazy roadmap for future storage. That LTO8 tape, which is the version of LTO shipping today, that is a 4-inch by 4-inch tape. 12 terabytes native, up to 30 terabytes compressed. With this roadmap committed to all the way out through LTO 12, you're actually going to see 192 terabytes in that same 4-inch by 4-inch space, up to 480 terabytes compressed. So this technology is really new technology in today's world, and how we think it helps with cloud adoption is quite simple. I wanted to use this quote, and I'm like, who originally said that? And I can't even give it attribution. It's been said so many times by so many people, and still, it's one of the most poignant messages we can deliver as you consider moving to the cloud. Where you put your data does not change your responsibility for it. So everything we've discussed today, from data breach protection and ransomware protection and regulation protection and adherence, from moving to the cloud, everything you do there, you still own the responsibility for that information. So if you look at how tape can work in a hybrid situation, is it gives you that true data air gap. There is no virus, there is no piece of malware or ransomware out there today that can instruct someone to physically go grab a tape off of the shelf and have that tape installed into a tape drive and then encrypted or deleted. And that's what we mean by an air gap. If you can electronically access that information, it is vulnerable, including in the cloud. So that's what this dual setup allows you to prevent. Now, some upsides is, we all know it's very inexpensive to get data into the cloud, or I would say relatively inexpensive. But when you go to restore information from the cloud, you have two issues. You have the bandwidth it's going to take to bring it back, and then you have the cost. It is usually anywhere from 10x to 20x the cost to restore a gig of data than it is to actually store it in the cloud. So when we bring it back, it can be very expensive. Now, if you're doing, a small directory or single files, this is great. It's going to be fast. It's not going to be expensive. But if you've got multiple servers that have been compromised and have to be rebuilt, or disaster recovery, the time alone it takes to get over your bandwidth might not be viable. And then you've got that unaccounted for expense, or that unbudgeted expense. If you've also got a copy to tape locally, it's very quick, very simple. I always like to say, never underestimate the bandwidth of a station wagon loaded down with boxes of tapes going 90 miles an hour down the highway. We can literally have petabytes of data back to you within an hour. And finally, the ease of changing cloud in the future. If you think about cloud adoption for storage, it's still relatively new. We're still figuring out where it works, where it doesn't, how it works. If you have all of your information in a cloud and you do not have a copy somewhere else locally, and you decide to go to a different cloud provider, you have to move that data, meaning everything I just discussed about bandwidth and cost can be crazy when you get into the hundreds of terabytes, or goodness help us all, when you're working with petabytes. So this is an easy way to say, I'll let that cloud contract expire. I've still got my data on site and I can move it to the next cloud. And we do all of this at pennies per gigabyte. And that's to own it forever versus the pennies per gigabyte per month as we store it in the cloud. So it's working with all of the technologies that we have together. And that's the quote I bring up next. It's from a top 10 technology trends for 2018 by Gartner. And I love this, a powerful statement. Making key decisions can lead to a long-term strategy that incorporates the best of as a service and the cloud without compromising IT's overall goals to both protect and enable the business. So as you think, what's your go-to-cloud strategy? Equally important, ask, what's your data at home strategy? And I would argue a robust and secure data protection solution should pull from all the best technologies available. In examining how a hybrid approach with tape can help leverage and enhance any off-premise or cloud storage options you choose, that is a great way to assure long-term strategies are sound. If we look at the storage from the physical storage end, tape is near and dear to my heart. We have small tape libraries all the way up to an exabyte library with multiple tape robot library exchangers, etc. We also do a full line of NAS storage for some of these other features that you will want to take advantage of with Veeam when you need a disk target for backup, or tier 1 storage offline, tier 1 storage offload, things of that nature. And of course, we also do object storage, and all of our disk and tape solutions are Veeam certified for backup and archive. So More good stuff to come for everyone that's joined us today. We've got a white paper specifically on that air gap written by Fred Moore, industry analyst who just does always engaging pieces. And we also, in the thank you email, will have a link that will allow you to download a digital copy of a book written by our CEO, Nathan Thompson, called Society's Genome, Genetic Diversity's Role in Digital Preservation. Takes an interesting twist with the biological approach to making sure that our data is secure. And if you would like a hard copy of the book, my email address is bobc, it's easy, BOBC @spectralogic.com. Write that down. If you want a hard copy of this book, it's actually a fairly entertaining read, and full disclosure, I helped work on it, but I'd be happy to send you a hard copy. Just email me, put book in the subject line, and give me a shipping address, and we'll get a hard copy shipped out to you. So we will leave you with a couple of calls to action. And I think, Matt, do we have you online with us?
You do, and I've learned a couple of things in addition to these calls to action over the course of the webinar, Bob, and since I've been quiet for the better part of an hour, this is a perfect opportunity for me to chime in.
Great.
The one, you beekeep, two, you're published author, and Nathan Thompson is as well, and Ron went a long way for a Patrice Rushen song reference. Forget-me-nots, if you missed that earlier, we're taking you back. So we'll entertain your beekeeping references and your 72 questions here momentarily. But, certainly, if you haven't necessarily, through the course of the webinar understood, the partnership that we have with Spectra Logic is very important. They're a valued alliance partner with us. And this whole element of achieving intelligent data management, right? We've talked about it, but the ability to manage data through the life cycle. And as Ron talked about, the customizability, if you will, of the Veeam architecture, so that you can take advantage of different technologies for different sources of data and protect yourself from these threats is important. So as you look at your environment and you try to figure out ways, you're looking for outside validation as to, does this make sense for my data set? Talk to us. We'd be happy to do that, right? That leads right into bullet point 2. Meet with us, have a discussion. Worst case scenario, you've got a third-party opinion, from somebody who's in the manufacturing side, on the disk side, as well as on the, on the tape side and the archival side. Have those conversations, understand that life cycle, because things have changed. And last but not least, right? Don't be afraid to look how to change your infrastructure to combat these threats. If there's one thing that we've seen, we go through these cycles where the breadth, if you will, of threats grows, but then we see them scale back and become more targeted. We're in that targeting phase now. As the value of Bitcoin goes, as goes the threat market, ironically enough. So it's a little bit like the stock market in a way. The threats are becoming targeted. People are being specific with regards to information that they're locking up. This cycle is going to continue. So you want to be proactive and make sure you take those preventative actions.
Beautiful.
Hey, and one thing I guess we'll tease everyone with. I mean, unfortunately, they don't give me the privilege of announcing product features, regrettably, of course. But one thing that you might look for, one of the things we haven't done with tape is, we didn't do it 2 revs ago to like V7 and then call it quits. We're done with tape. So we've continued to incrementally enhance our tape support and tape capability. Such as, more recently, you can restore a VM directly from tape. You don't have to stage it to a repository, things like that. There are some really cool things that are coming for tape support in Veeam in the update 4 release later this year. So stay tuned is all I can say. So
Outstanding. All right, so I want to ask if we have questions. Katie, I think some of those were coming through the organizer. We're at the top of the hour, so we've literally run over our time, but what do you think? Should we take a couple of questions here?
We do have one that came in. So the question is, what prevents a hacker from using a sound recording code to listen to what the tapes have on them when you're transferring to the tape?
Okay, so that would be a matter of encryption. There's, encryption in transit and encryption at rest. So when you're transferring information to a tape, it could either be direct attach or it could be over a network. It could be over any various numbers of wire. So you're going to want to look at encryption in transit as it moves to the tape. So let me ask you, Ron, you mentioned where you encrypt and you encrypt out to the cloud. If you are sending information from a server to a tape, before it gets to that tape and has the encryption there, would you guys have any form of encryption there, or would we simply rely on something like HTTPS for the security?
Yeah, well, you can actually encrypt the backups. So if your backup repository was encrypted, the data stream that we would send over would already be, we're just reading from the backup repository, and it would be already encrypted. So
Gotcha. So we'd have you covered.
So yeah, it would be already done for you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. It looks like we might have a couple more questions coming in. What we'll do is respond to those individually. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, look for that thank you email because it will have links for the book as well as the white paper. And remember, Bob C. at Spectra Logic, if you want a hard copy, send an email, and we will look forward to the next time. Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Matt. And we'll talk to you all soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.